Hello and welcome to this lecture on Chapter 3 for your subject Finance 504. This is a good chapter. It's actually a simple chapter. Evaluation of financial performance using ratio analysis. Essentially, the whole point of this is to evaluate strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for a firm. Like, for example, if you take the case of current ratio or quick ratio or return on assets or return on equity, all these tell you a picture about a company. The whole point of this exercise is to ensure that you find out what the weak points of your company are and you find out how to strengthen them. And if you are an analyst, it's your job to look at the ratios of a company and decide whether the company is worth investing in or not. So, what are the uses of financial analysis? The whole point of this is to identify the major strengths and weaknesses of a firm. Like, these are used by several people. Financial managers use it all the time to see where, if ever, they are going wrong or where things can be improved, because things can always be improved. Credit managers use it to analyze corporations when corporations apply for credit. Security analysts use it to analyze securities. Bankers use it all the time, and bankers and credit managers are somewhat similar in their job description. Unions use it to see if they can seek a fair share of the company's profits. And students and job hunters use it to see if the prospective company they're applying to is doing a good job or not. So based on all these, we are going to be looking at what is known as ratio analysis. Ratios, what is the point of ratios? Ratios are kind of like this. They standardize various elements of financial data. Like, for example, when you or I go get a physical, and a medical doctor is looking at our physical results. Okay, they look to see if everything that they measure falls in a certain parameters that are considered normal. Anything that's not considered normal would show some abnormality with our health. Ratio analysis is the same thing for a company. Ratio analysis does for a company what a physical does for a human being. It checks to see if everything is normal or acceptable at that industry level, or if it is bad or great or something. So it also for differences in size and a series of financial data when making comparisons over time and between firms. Now, ratios are classified into several different methods. Like liquidity ratios measure the liquidity of a firm. Okay, they measure the liquidity of a firm. Asset management tells you how the assets of a company are managed. Financial leverage shows you the advantage of using a debt and seeing whether this company is taking advantage of it or is it turning out into a disadvantage. Profitability ratios check how much of it the company is earning. Then you got market-based ratios and dividend policy. All these are different ratios. We are going to be taking a look at one of them. Now, to create ratio analysis and to compute ratios, you need some raw material. What are the raw material that you have? Well, let us start with the first one, the balance sheet. Now, what is the balance sheet? The balance sheet has assets, liabilities, and shareholders' equity. Now, if you remember all the major things that you've been taught, one of the main things you've been taught, and I hope you've been taught this because if you took a class in accounting, they probably covered this. Assets equal liabilities plus shareholders' equity. One side of the balance sheet has the assets. Okay, if you look at this company, for example, Drake Manufacturing Company is the example used in this particular chapter here. If you look at this company, one of the things you see is the total assets. Assets are divided into, you see the order of the assets here. This is the asset side, and I'm going to be using yellow highlighter for asset side. You can see the most liquid assets come first, like cash is the most liquid, then come marketable securities, then accounts receivable, then inventories, then comes plant and equipment. The lower an asset is in the order, the less liquid it is. So this part are called current assets, and these part are called fixed assets. And total assets is fixed assets, which is current assets plus fixed assets equal total assets. Now, as you can see, the total is 81,890. So the total asset size of this company went from $77,000 to $81,890 by the next year. Now, if you look at this, now let's look at liabilities. Liabilities and shareholders' equity are exactly the same as assets, as you can see. And that's the reason they call this liabilities and shareholders' equity. So liabilities and shareholders' equity exactly equal assets. And even here, you start off by the most current liabilities, the ones that come due quickly. These are all current liabilities. And current portion of long-term debt is also considered current liabilities. So you have current liabilities, then you have long-term debt, which in itself is something. Then you have common stock, which is equity. Common stock, retained earnings all contribute to equity. When you look at this, you can look at it and it creates a picture for you. Like, for example, if you look at how much cash went up by, how much marketable securities went up by, how much total current assets went up by, like that, so on. We are going to be looking at all this stuff. The other important statements are income statement, where you see net sales, cost of sales, other operating expenses, interest expenses, all these things. You can look at, you start with, one of the funny things about the income statement you must realize is there is almost always only one incoming thing. Net sales is the only positive cash inflow thing. Everything else is an expense. You deduct from there. So the order of this, if you're a business student, you need to know how an income statement is created. You start off with net sales. Then from that you deduct cost of sales. The difference between them is gross margin. From that you deduct operating expenses. Then you get earnings before interest and taxes. From there you deduct interest. Then you get earnings before taxes. From that you pay taxes. And then you get profits after tax. Now this is the series until here. Remember, not just for this particular chapter, but for all time. Remember this, it is very, very important. Which comes where? When do you pay interest? You pay interest after you calculate EBIT, but before you complete EBT, compute EBT, like that, so on. You also have other information like how much dividends they paid and all that here. Market price per share is $24. Book value per share is $26. Now you look at this. This is actually not a good sign. This is a bad sign. If the book value is greater than market value, that means this company is in major trouble. We are going to take a look at that in the near future. Now, key financial statements. Let's take a look at key financial statements. What are key financial statements? You have common size balance sheet, common size income statement. What it basically does is it shows every asset as percentage of total assets and every liability as percentage of total liabilities and stockholders' equity. So you look at that. That means you see this way it becomes easier. It was 2.7. Like, for example, you can say cash was 2.7 earlier of the total assets. Now it is 3.1. That's a lot more than earlier. Then you look at you get the marketable securities. You got accounts receivable, inventories. Inventories has actually gone down for this company, but you can look at there is not a significant difference between the total current assets and actually their fixed assets also roughly remain the same, which by default they are, because if current assets don't change much and the balance sheet has gone up as percentage, it has. Now if you look at current liabilities, they're actually a lot over. They have gone up quite a bit, and from 27 to 31 is 4% change, whereas long-term debt actually has come down. But if you look at total liabilities, it has roughly not changed much since the last time. If you remember, it's roughly been around 58.3 to 58, which is negligible. And the same thing here, everything is shown as a percentage of net sales. Now, one of the main things you must remember is we want to make sure as a company that the percentage of this 4.4 out of 100, that's what we want to increase. We want it to be 5 or 7 or 8 or 10. The whole point of all this exercise is to make sure your earnings after taxes available to common shareholders is higher than what it was previously. Let us start off with the ratios. Let us start with liquidity ratios. Liquidity ratios means these test the liquidity. That means a firm's ability to meet its short-term obligations. Let us start with the first of these, current ratios. Current ratio is current assets divided by current liabilities. Now, this is by far the most taught first ratio. Current assets, it shows just how much of your current liabilities are covered by your current assets. Quick ratio, on the other hand, is a more stringent version of the current ratio in that you exclude inventories. Now, why do we exclude inventories? Because contrary to what is generally thought, inventories are not easy to get rid of. Like, for example, you know it and I know it, that companies have this board called sale all the time. That basically means inventory is not moving out, right? Isn't that what it is? So that's what we are talking about here. And I also want all of you to know, like, for example, every Saturday, and I love my Saturday mornings because I wake up late. Every Saturday, more or less, I'm woken up and my wife says, come on, let's go to JCPenney. They have a this weekend only sale. And I tell her, come on, they have this 52 times a year, this Saturday only sale. So why are you making me wake up every Saturday? We went there just 2 weeks ago. She says, that was once. Now they have new clothes and they are all sale. I said, new clothes are not on sale. Anything that's on sale is old. She said, you're always a pessimist. Now get up and let's get ready and go. So I get up and get ready and we go. One of the main things is, it's the same thing with cars or most other inventories. And also inventories deplete in value, especially perishable inventories. So inventories are not as quick to get rid of and convert to cash as other current assets like receivables or cash itself are. Therefore, quick ratio is a more stringent version of the current ratio. Now, if you look at this particular slide, here they look at the aging schedule of your accounts receivable. What it basically means is how quickly are your customers paying you. Now, 51.6% of the percentage of customers are paying you in less than 30 days. 28.2 in 30 to 59 days, in 2 months. And in 3 months, another 15 are paying. 5.2 are not paying on time. That's total accounts receivable. So that's called the aging schedule. So what you look for is how long does it take for you to collect your money from your customers that you have lent to, that you have sold to on credit. And the way to calculate it is take accounts receivable divided by daily credit sales. Now, how do you get daily credit sales? If you calculate this particular formula, this is nothing but this generally looks at how efficient your collection system is based on accounts receivable divided by annual credit sales divided by 365, which is basically is daily credit sales. It shows, like, for example, a company that has 40 is generally considered more efficient than another company which has 50 in its particular in particular business. So inventory turnover is on the other end of it. It shows how quickly you're converting your inventory into sales. How quickly you're processing your inventory. So it looks at how cost of sales, which is divided by average inventories, give you that. Okay, next we come to asset management ratios. Now, what are asset management ratios? Asset management ratios are basically turnover ratios. Now, what do you mean by turnover ratios? Let me give you all a good example here. You go to some restaurants, okay, and you have no reservation. They expect you to wait 45 minutes for a table, and you wait and you're happy to wait. You go to other restaurants, even on a Friday evening, the whole restaurant is not full. So some people, now there was this guy I knew. Whatever subject you talk to about him, he always has a good answer and a knowledgeable answer. And he reads a lot. It's not that I don't read a lot, I read a lot too. But I always used to wonder, how does he have more than 24 hours in a day? Basically, every company has some assets from which they try to generate sales. Some companies do a very good job of generating a lot of sales out of the assets. Some don't. So this shows how efficiently you are using your assets to convert them into sales. The higher this ratio is, the better off you are. Especially this one, fixed asset turnover ratio. It shows how well you are using your fixed assets. Total asset turnover ratio includes current assets too. That's the other turnover ratio. Next come the debt ratios. Debt ratios measure how much debt is part of your total assets. Now, ideally, you want this less than 50%. But there are companies like banking companies. Banks, for example, have humongous amounts of debt. Okay, humongous amounts of debt. So banks have very, very little equity. You all did not know that, did you? Banks have very little equity. Then debt to equity ratios, which is total debt by total equity. So these two are good ratios to have. They measure the leverage. That means basically how much of debt you're using. Then leverage management ratios means, if, like, for example, if I'm the bondholder of a firm and a company has, normally, let us say that company has 50,000 in EBIT and they have to pay 5,000 in interest charges every year. And I have bonds in this company. I feel comfortable knowing that their times interest earned ratio is 10 times. Why? Because even if their profits fall 50%, I'll get paid. So I have no problem. Now, if let us say the company, instead of having 50,000, had only 10,000, it's still covered twice, but I'm not as comfortable as I would be. I'll think, okay, what if this company makes a huge loss one year? I won't be getting my interest, which is due to me. So that shows that. And this particular ratio shows the fixed charge coverage. EBIT plus lease payments divided by, if you look at all these are fixed amounts that you pay every year. Lease payments are included both in the numerator and the denominator. Now let us look at the gross profit margin ratio, which is sales minus cost of sales by sales, and net profit margin ratio, which is earnings after taxes by sales. Both are very important ratios. We're going to be talking a lot about these. Now, let's turn to profitability ratios. Profitability ratios, return on investment or total assets ratio, earnings after taxes by total assets. Earnings after taxes by total assets gives you return on investment ratio. Then return on shareholders equity ratio is earnings after taxes by shareholders equity. Now, I want all of you to take a small detour with me here. Like, for example, remember what I told you all in the beginning of this class. What did I tell you all at the beginning of this class? Assets equal debt plus equity, right? Which is debt is total liabilities plus equity. Now, let us say assets is 100, debt is 50, equity is 50. So if a company has got earnings after taxes of, say, 10, what will that company's return on assets be? 10 by 100, right? Which is 10%. Return on equity will be 10 by 50, which is what? 20%? Yeah, even I can do that. Okay, 20%. Now I want all of you to notice one thing. The more debt you have, the higher will be return on shareholders' equity as compared to return on assets. What do I mean by that? Now, you want to know, what I want you all to learn here is, why do companies love to issue debt? It is because of this specific reason. Now, imagine a scenario like this. 100 assets equal debt plus equity. 100 equals, let us say, 90 plus 10. Now, you might ask me, hey, who will lend you $90 when your equity is 10? Believe me, there are companies that do that, and I'm going to show you that in 1 minute. Bear with me here. Now, these are the kind of companies that make 1.5% ROA in a good year. However, 1.5% ROA, that means 1.5% of 100, would be actually 15% ROE. I know you are all thinking, hey, how is it possible that, a company will have $90 in debt for $10 in equity? Let me show you all an example here. I'm taking you all to one of my favorite websites to go to here. Okay, now Fred database and return on average assets for all US banks. Okay, return on our average assets for all US banks. Now remember, I'm not making up these numbers. They are from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. I want all of you to look at this. This is the return on all average assets for all banks in the United States between 1984 and today. Okay, do you see this? It is never really 1% almost until 1994. Then it goes beyond 1. Remember the great time in the 90s? You must have read about it. In case some of you are younger, you must have read about how great the 90s were. Now, in 2006, when the subprime crisis started hitting, they start going down, and of course, they really go to negatives here. And then they recover to go past roughly around 1 again. Right now, it's 95. Now, look at this as a percentage. You got less than 1% most of the time. Return on assets. These are for banks. Now, I want all of you to take a look at return on equity for all US banks. Now, this is for all banks combined in our country. Let me go to, I just changed it from US ROA to ROE. I want all of you to take a look at this. This is for return on equity for banks. Now, look at the percentages. First of all, the percentages on the y-axis are no longer 0.2, 0.4. They are 0, 5, 10, 15. Now, do you see? This is the same picture as the earlier. Only thing is, this curve, the rates are much higher. Do you all see that? The rates are much higher, even through recessions. Of course, they made a loss here, but then again, they got back into profit, and they're making pretty close to 8.4%. Now, it is 8.4% here, whereas here, it was what? 0.95. That shows how little equity banks have. I mean, you're not even making 1% when calculate return on assets, whereas on equity, you're making 8.4. That shows that the debt portion, or in case of banks, we call it deposits. Deposits to a bank is a liability. That means it's their form of debt, is big. And now you know why they need deposit insurance for banks. Can you imagine any business where in case you make a mistake, you don't pay, your shareholders don't pay, but a deposit insurance corporation pays them back? Why? Because of this very reason. Banks have very small profit margins, because of which they use debt. They use debt to increase their, like for example, 1.5 ROA is 15% ROE for a bank. You all just saw it. I didn't make it up. That was there, right? Market-based ratios, which this is a very important ratio, especially when you consider how people value stocks. Like, for example, let me go here. I'll show you another one here, finance.yahoo.com. Now go here and let's type in Wells Fargo, since that is there. WFC, let's go there. See, the one ratio that's always mentioned is price divided by earnings. How much did they earn last year? Earnings per share, 4.189 per share. So if you take the price, previous close divided by earnings, you get P ratio. It's a very important ratio, especially if you're buying stocks, if you're analyzing stocks. It shows how much, the higher this is, the more valued the company is in the eyes of the stockholders. And this is another one which shows how much your company's value increased compared to its book value. This is EBIT DA ratio. Now, this is an important ratio, payout ratio. What do you mean by payout ratio? Dividend ratio tells you dividends per share divided by earnings per share. Like Coca-Cola is a company that constantly pays a dividend all the time. Berkshire Hathaway is a company that has not paid a dividend in nearly 50 years, or a little over 50 years. So, depends on the nature of the company. Like Berkshire Hathaway recently even said, those guys said, hey, guess what? We have money. If anyone has a good project they can't invest in, please tell that to us. We'll invest it. They got that kind of money. They don't believe in paying out dividends at all. Whereas when you take the case of something like Coca-Cola, they pay very regular dividends. So now that you learned all the ratios, let me look at Drake, the numbers we looked at for Drake Manufacturing earlier, and let us analyze it as compared with their industry. Let us start with the quick ratio. Now, if you look at the quick ratio here, this company is roughly the same as where the industry is. As you can see, both the industry, which is represented by the dark blue, and Drake are very close to each other. Now, that means this company is roughly where the industry average is, which is fine. Okay. Now, let us look at their debt ratio. Now, when you look at their debt ratio, you notice something about Drake. That Drake initially started off in 2010 and 2011, where their debt equaled that of the average in the industry. Okay. You see that until here. Okay. Why isn't my pen working? There you go. Until here. After that, Drake has started issuing more and more debt. Now remember, this is debt to assets ratio. That means debt as a percentage of assets has actually exceeded 50 in case of Drake. Now let's go back up here. Where is the leverage ratio? Debt ratio is total debt by total assets. That's the one we are talking about. Now if you look at Drake, they already got less than 50% of their assets financed with equity. That means they're in some trouble. You got to understand that they are in some trouble. Now, go down to the next one, the average collection period. Now, if you look at the average collection period for this company, first of all, it was always higher than the industry. But the gap seems to be a lot more wide now than it was earlier, which means their marginal efficiency as compared to the average company in the industry is dropping. You understand what I mean? This company is now collecting once every 60 days. It's now taking 60 days for them to collect debt, whereas when you think of what is this industry, it's 45 days. So your efficiency is like 15 days more. That's a lot in most industries. Now, all this higher debt ratio, average collection period, that means giving better credit terms to your customers, all this would work out if you're actually making more profit or if you're able to sell more? Obviously not, because the industry sales, total asset turnover, what is total asset turnover? Total asset turnover, you remember turnover ratios. What was total asset turnover? Here. Sales by total assets. Now if you look at that, this company, for the level of assets they have, are actually selling less than the industry average. Again, things seem to be getting worse. I mean, you'd accept this somehow, but this is becoming hard to swallow. So Drake seems to be consistently doing worse than the industry. Now, look at return on investment. Obviously, this doesn't surprise us, considering that we already looked at the ratios and they see. Now, remember one thing. No one goes into any competition thinking, I'm going to be average. You go into a competition thinking, I'm going to win. You want to compare yourself with the best in the industry, not the average. But if you are doing this bad compared to the average, imagine how bad you are doing compared to the best in the industry. Their return on investment or return on assets is actually very low. And it is not surprising, their return on equity is also just as low. Again, you see the gap widening here. Here they managed to keep track because they kept on increasing their debt. Because of that, since they are making some profits, it is higher. It actually looks more parallel, but this company really needs to get its act together. So overall, it appears that this company is not doing well. So what we do is we look at analysis of profitability, which means return on investment. Return on investment is the same as return on assets. Which is earnings after taxes by sales, and sales multiplied by total assets, and sales cancels out, it's earnings after taxes by total assets. Now this is called the DuPont analysis. This is a name for DuPont company, which as you all know is one of the more popular companies. They came up with this analysis way back in the 1940s when they wanted to see how good they were compared to the rest of the industry. So based on this, what you basically do here is, here you have, first of all, sales, total expenses. So this part looks at your expense control. That gives you your earnings after taxes. Earnings after taxes divided by sales give you net profit margin. Here you look at your asset management. Okay, current assets, fixed assets, we count total assets. Sales divided by total assets. So this is turnover ratio, how well you're using your assets. That comes total asset turnover. You multiply net profit margin by total asset turnover, you get return on assets. And you multiply that with total assets to shareholders' equity, you get return on shareholders' equity. Now, this is the formula they're talking about. Return on shareholders' equity is net, this is not market. Let me rephrase that. Net profit margin. This is not net profit market. Net profit margin which is equal to earnings after taxes by sales, and sales cancels out with sales here. Total asset multiplied by total asset turnover multiplied by equity multiplier. Now these three things look at three different things. This looks at your operational expenses. This looks at your operating efficiency. And this looks at debt management. Now, let me ask you all this. When will ROA equal ROE? You know, there are times when ROA will equal ROE. When assets equal equity. That means when a company has no debt, assets will equal equity. In that case, the last ratio, equity multiplier, will be 1 because total assets will equal shareholders' equity. But normally they are not. Most companies use debt because that's an advantage that you can that you can use. Now, sources of competitive financial data, you can get that. A word of caution about financial ratio analysis. Ratios are only as reliable as the accounting data on which they're based. That's very true, guys. I mean, that's as true as it comes. Like, for example, if you looked at the ratios for Enron in 2002, just before they went bankrupt, you would have said this is an exceptional company. That's because all the numbers, at least a lot of the numbers, were incorrect. Okay, be cautious about industry norms without some measure of dispersion. Okay, well, that is genuinely true. I mean, if you look at it, industry norms does not necessarily mean everyone has the same advantage. Just as every human being has some advantages compared to others. Like, for example, there is this guy I know, probably the biggest genius I've ever known. Okay? To this day, he struggles to go into any management position because he just cannot get along with people at all. Whenever someone is less intelligent than him, he makes it a point to rub it in. And I always wonder, does it not occur to him, a man of his level of intelligence, that most others are not that intelligent? It's not because they don't have it. He possesses it naturally. The same thing goes for companies. Some companies have comparative advantages. De Beers has a comparative advantage in diamond mining. So you have to worry about measures of dispersion too. Like, for example, how much of a company's profits are dependent on this particular good. Whereas, like, for example, take the case of Coca-Cola versus Pepsi-Cola. To me, that's a classic battle. I mean, Coca-Cola is a product that has tremendous amount of brand loyalty across the world. Pepsi has beaten them in power drinks. I mean, in workout drinks, because Gatorade outsells Powerade, 5-1 across the world. A lot of people don't even know that Powerade exists. Pepsi has taken over bottling companies and has started selling bottled water in the early 90s, and today it is a big industry, and Pepsi is right up there in there. Pepsi is also number 1 in chips. But still, Coke has that one advantage that was derived in the 19th century. That Coke appeals more to the taste buds of human beings than any other soft drink. And there is no way Pepsi can beat that easily. I mean, there are a lot of people who prefer Pepsi, but Coke's loyalty continues through generations. So you have to measure dispersion also. And dispersion means standard deviation, mean deviation. All those things are measures of dispersion. Comparative analysis depends on availability of data for each industry. That also is true. And ratios look at historic, not futuristic information. All these are true. But despite all this, it is possible that it will work out. Now, what do you mean by managing your earnings? Managing your earnings basically means, to use a form, window dressing. Okay, now, like, for example, let's take the case of poor old Sri Nipani. Okay, whenever we have people coming over the weekend, my wife puts me to work on Friday afternoons, cleaning, getting things together, making the house more presentable than it normally is. Okay, I'm sure some of you can relate to that. And I say, who cares? They're coming to visit us. Let me relax. Friday evening, let me have a couple of beers, watch TV. She says, no, we don't want them to think like that. I want you to do this. I want you to do this. And it's not like I'm sitting down. I'm doing all this. I said, okay. Don't fight. So what I mean is, same thing, firms do that. Like, for example, for those of you who know accounting, know from changing from first in, first out to last in, first out. As an inventory system, you can change your profits. You can change the way your profits look. You can also change it by changing the method of depreciation for your company. So all these things, high quality earnings tend to be cash earnings. Distortion in earnings can arise from such issues as time of revenue recognition, which is again FIFO, LIFO thingy, and amortization of intangible assets. Intangible assets mean goodwill. Somehow you think that people have goodwill for you. Now, these are earnings management tricks. Timing asset sales in a way that keeps earnings growing at a smooth rate. Acceleration of shipments at the end of a quarter to increase reported sales. Capitalizing normal operating expenses. Extending depreciable life of assets. Using big bath write-offs, using spin control to explain bad earnings. Using reserves to smooth earnings. And focusing on adjusted rather than traditional earnings. So, I can give you all a very good example of this. A long time ago, nearly 20 years ago, I met two guys at a conference in Hawaii. One was getting a PhD in finance. The other was someone who was just interested in finance. And I could see that one of them was brought into the company to increase sales. He reduced quality standards. The other told me that, right now they've reduced the quality standards, so we are actually sending out really bad product. In 3 months, the customers will complain. And in 6 months, if we don't fire this guy, we are going to lose. The company will go bankrupt. And he told me that behind the other guy's back. I was amused because, first of all, I never met those two guys before. The next year, I saw the guy who was supposed to get fired had actually gotten fired, and he comes and tells me, Shri, when they hired me, they told me to increase sales. So I cut a few corners, and that was what they asked me to do. They encouraged me to do that. Later on, they fired me, and they told me that if I stayed in that position for 6 more months, the company would go bankrupt. And to this day, I think, how come the other guy is not the boss? And I became a friend of the other guy, the guy who predicted all this would happen. I became a very good friend of his over a period of time because he has no real finance background. But somehow he thinks of himself as a researcher. So he shows up at all the finance conferences. And I noticed one thing. Despite lack of formal knowledge, his knowledge of finance is very high. And he actually, when he reads your papers, he makes suggestions that a normal traditional person does not think. So he makes suggestions like a very brilliant layperson that help increase the quality of my papers a lot of times. So one of the things I noticed about him, and he was the one I was referred to earlier in the class, has a very high IQ. He just cannot get along with anyone. And I always look at him and think, you are depriving some company, some top 500 company of a great CEO. If only you learned that other people have feelings and they are not as intelligent as you all the time. You got natural intelligence, but most of the others don't. And he won't rise above his position in a small company in Florida because he just cannot get along with anyone else. And even that job he's keeping because his older sister, who dotes on him, is actually married to the president of the company. Otherwise, they would have fired him long ago. And he himself told me that. They would have fired me long ago. Even my brother-in-law hates me, but he's afraid of my sister. She controls him. And I always think, you're so intelligent. I really wish I was as intelligent as you. How can you not understand that people actually have feelings? And to this day, I have no answer. And normally, he treats people very badly. But somehow, for some unfathomable reason, he always treated me very well. And man, I tell you one thing. He uses excellent pronouns for people. And you all get my drift. All right, these are the other things. Market value added, economic value added. You can read from the textbook about this. Basically, these are concepts that were created by Stern Stewart to see. Market value is basically how much the company increased in value over a period of time. Let's do a few problems here, and we can call it a day. Take out your textbooks, please. It's in, let's see. Let's look at problem 6 in the textbook. Problem 6 is in page 106. All right, let's get started on this. Tar Heel Furniture Company is planning to establish a wholly owned subsidiary to manufacture upholstery fabrics. Tar Heel expects to earn $1 million after taxes on the venture during the first year. The president of Tar Heel wants to know what the subsidiary's balance sheet would look like. The president believes that it would be advisable to begin the new venture with ratios that are similar to industry average. Tar Heel plans to make all their sales on credit. All calculations assume a 365-day year. In your computations, you should round all numbers to the nearest 1,000. Based on industry average financial ratios presented here, complete the projected balance sheet of Tar Heel's upholstery subsidiary. They've given you current ratio, quick ratio, net profit margin ratio, average collection period, debt ratio, total asset ratio, and current liabilities to shareholders' equity. Now, the last one I want all of you to notice, current liabilities to shareholders' equity, it is not part, again I'm repeating, it is not part of the traditional ratio analysis that we have studied so far. So there must be a particular reason for them to give you that. Now, in the next page, you see the forecasted balance sheet. So this is the forecasted balance sheet. Now let us see if we can fill up each of these numbers, okay? Now, obviously, this is the asset side, and this is the liabilities and equity side. Okay, now, going back here. Now, how do we solve a problem like this? Let me start here. The best way to solve a problem like this is simply this. I want you to start off by looking at this. See what number is given to you. What real number? Tar Heel expects to earn $1 million after taxes on the venture during the first year. That is the one real number given to you. Now see which ratio you can fit it into. Can you fit it into current ratio? No, because current ratio is current assets by current liabilities. Can you fit it into quick ratio? No. Net profit margin ratio. Now, there you have an answer. Net profit margin ratio is earnings after taxes divided by sales. So, by using that, you can actually calculate the sales. So, how do we do that? We are told that net profit is 5%. So, if it is 5%, that means 1 million by sales is 5%. So sales have to be 20 million. You now know what sales are. You know sales is 20 million. But obviously you cannot put sales in a balance sheet. That's an income statement thingy. But you can use the information you got by solving this to find something else. And what is that something else? When you have sales, see which ratios you can fit sales into. Current ratio, no. Quick ratio, no. Net profit margin ratio, we already used it. Average collection period. Can use it there. We'll come to that in a minute. Debt ratio, no. Total asset turnover ratio. That means total assets sales divided by total assets. So if sales is 20 million, and total assets have got to be, and $20 million divided by total assets is 2. That makes total assets equal to 10 million. So we got our first real number for the balance sheet here. Immediately, first thing we need to do is go to the balance sheet and plug it in. So let's go here. Total assets, 10 million. Now, if total assets is 10 million, that means Total liabilities and shareholders' equity is also 10 million. Remember, on the balance sheet, assets equal liabilities plus equity. So if we know this is 10, we know this is 10 too. So we already got started. We now know that there is some information we already got started with. Now let us see. Now that we know what total assets are, we will know what total debt is. Because see, debt ratio is right above that. And it says total debt to total assets is 40%. So if debt is 40% of assets, that means debt is what? 4 million. If debt is 4 million, then what is equity? It's got to be 6 million, right? So let's go back there. Debt is 4 million. Okay, wait a minute. We know debt is 4 million. We calculated this there. That means 10 million is total liabilities and shareholders' equity. Debt is 4 million. The difference between them is 6 million is shareholders' equity. See? One step at a time, we can fill out the balance sheet one step at a time. Now that you know what shareholders' equity is, you can see where you can fit it. Current ratio, no. Quick ratio, no. Net profit margin ratio, no. Average collection period, not yet. Debt ratio, okay. Current liabilities to shareholders' equity is 20%. So current liabilities to shareholders' equity is 20% means we know that shareholders' equity is 6 million. Current liabilities have to be 1/5 of it, which is 1.2 million, right? Let's go back and plug it in. 1.2 million, 1.2 million is current liabilities. We know that total debt is 4 million. The difference between them is long-term debt. So we have total current liabilities is 1.2 million, long-term debt is 2.8, and total debt is 4 million. We got one side of our balance sheet completely done. It's done. Now we need to just look at the asset side. And all this came from just one assets point. Okay, let's go back there. Now we know what current liabilities are. So that makes the first two ratios given there very useful. Current ratio is current assets divided by current liabilities is 2. That means if current liabilities are 1.2 million, current assets have to be 2.4 million. So let's go and fill that out. It is 2.4 million. There you go. So we know that total current assets are 2.4 million because they are twice of current liabilities. If this is 2.4 million total current assets and total assets is 10 million, the difference between them is net fixed assets, which is 7.6 million. We have taken care of total assets, net fixed assets, total current assets. Now we need to know which of the current assets is what amount. That's all that's left. And for that, we go here. This is the second part. Now, I already showed you how to get this. Total assets minus current assets is fixed assets. Now, let's look at quick ratio. Quick ratio is 1:1. Quick ratio is 1:1, which basically means current assets minus inventories divided by 1.2. That gives inventories of 1.2 million. So we know that inventories is 1.2 million. Now, finally, we use current ratio, we use quick ratio, we use net profit ratio. We never use the average collection period. Average collection period is accounts receivable divided by daily credit sales. So we know 20, we are told is the average collection period, is accounts receivable by 20 million divided by 365. Solving for accounts receivable, you get 1,096,000, when you round it up here. So let us plug that in. $1,096,000. So take 240, which is total current assets, minus 120, which is inventory, minus accounts receivable. The rest has got to be cash. So now we are done with both sides. That's how, ladies and gentlemen, you work a problem. One step at a time. Find the number you have. They'll give you one number at least. See where you can fit it. And from that, the result you get, you fit it into another one. And the other one, it's kind of like weaving a basket. Just like that. Only thing is, it's a lot easier than weaving a basket. I once tried my hand at weaving. Didn't work out. Now we come to the last problem. This problem deals with the DuPont equation, which is the most important concept in this particular chapter. All right, let's get started on problem 9, the last problem here. Okay, now this is a very good problem because it deals with the DuPont equation. I already mentioned that before. Let me read it out. Gulf Controls has a net profit margin of 10% and earnings after taxes of $600,000. Its current balance sheet is given there. You got current assets, fixed assets, current liabilities, long-term debt, common stock, retained earnings. Look at their retained earnings. This is what long-standing companies look like. Their common stock will be a lot less than retained earnings because retained earnings are accumulated over a period of time. Calculate Gulf's return on stockholders' equity. Now, stockholders' equity is not just equity stock, but it includes retained earnings. So, 500,000 plus 1.9 million. Now, what you got here, return on equity, this is equity, which is common stock plus retained earnings. So you got 500,000 plus 1.9 million. That's where you got this. So 600,000 by 2.4 million is 25%, which is a very high return on equity, by the way, for most companies. Part B of the question. The industry average ratios are as follows. They gave you the net profit margin. Net profit margin is, let us say, the industry's DuPont equation. The industry's DuPont equation is net profit margin is 6%. Industry is 6% multiplied by total asset turnover is 2.5 multiplied by equity multiplier is 1.4, which is what? 6 times 2.5 is 15, right? 6 times 2 is 12, 0.5 is 3, so 15 multiplied by 1.4. What is 40% of 15? 6. 21? I think this is 21%. Yeah, it is 21%. Now compare Gulf with industry average. With the average firm in the industry, what is the source of major differences between Gulf and industry ratios? So we already know the return on equity. Okay. I mean, we know that Gulf is 25%. We know this. Industry return on equity is 21. We know that. Now, first of all, we need to find out our net profit margin. Our net profit margin, sales by net profit margin. So sales have to be, they told us net profit margin is 10%. So we know this is 10%. Now you need to know total asset turnover. For that, you need to know sales. Sales would be, you know that total assets for this company is 4 million as per the balance sheet given there. And you know sales, if 600,000 is 10%, sales have got to be 6 million. So 6 million by 4 million, this is sales by total assets, gives you 1.5 times is total asset turnover. So multiplied by 1.5. Okay, so we know total asset turnover. Now Finally, equity multiplier. What is equity multiplier? That is total assets divided by total equity, which is 4 million divided by 2.4 million, which is 1.67 times. So you multiply it with 1.67, you should get the 25. Now we need to compare. Now, first of all, unlike Drake that we saw earlier, Gulf is doing better than the industry average. But is there any scope for improvement? There is. Why? I'll tell you why. Look at this. You're making 1.5 here. The average in the industry is 2.5. Let us say you can go to the average. Imagine if you go to the average, what will happen? 10 into 2.5 multiplied by 1.67. What is that? Let's see, what is that? 10 multiplied by 2.5 multiplied by 1.67. You can almost take it to 41% or nearly 42%. That's a lot. That's a lot. So I want all of you to think of that. They can improve. So if you look at this, they highlighted here, Gulf combines significantly higher than an average profit margin, which is 40% more than the industry average, with a higher equity multiplier, with a significantly lower than average total asset turnover. So there is scope for improvement. Well, that is chapter 3. Work a few problems. I'm going to be asking you questions in this chapter. I will not be asking you questions like, what is current assets by current liabilities? Not that simple. The questions that I ask you will be analytical in nature. Like, for example, if I might ask you to give you return on assets and return on equity and ask you to calculate the debt ratio. You should be able to do that. So stuff like that. Okay, it will be analytical like this DuPont equation. And that is this chapter, chapter 3. I'll talk to you all again in chapter 4.